Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's presentation, Filming the Wild Part 2, Wildlife Videography in the Field, is brought to you by NatHab Expedition Leader Aditya Panda. Aditya is an award-winning naturalist, wildlife conservationist, and photographer from Odisha, India, where passion for nature was sparked by his grandfather's jungle tales. More than 2 decades of experience, he's dedicated his career to protecting tiger and elephant habitats while serving as honorary wildlife warden at Satkosia Tiger Reserve and working closely with government officials and local communities. As a NatHab expedition leader and an accomplished wildlife photographer, Aditya brings both conservation expertise and a storyteller's gift for helping guests discover the incredible challenges and wonders of India's wildest places. Well, welcome. Glad you're here today. We might have to ask you to do a webinar about your grandfather's jungle tales sometime. But for now, let's stick to the Filming the Wild Part 2. Take it away, Aditya.
Thank you, Rob. And hello, everyone. I hope you've been doing well and had a nice weekend. Here in India, we are entering the end of the summer and the monsoons and entering the festive season before autumn sets in and the jungles reopen and we are all back on safari. So welcome back to my second part on this topic as promised last month. I'm sure a lot of you, if not all of you, have watched part 1, which I presented in August. And here is part 2 as promised. But before I dive into the webinar, let me reintroduce myself for those of you who haven't traveled with me and those of you who haven't watched one of my webinars before. Rob, of course, did an amazing job of introducing me. I just wanted to add that I have been leading NatHab expeditions since 2016, and I primarily guide our tiger expeditions, including the photographic ones. So Grand India Wildlife Adventure, India Tiger Safari, and the India Tiger Photo Expedition are where you're likely to find me in the company of tigers in the jungles of India. So yes, without further ado, let's dive into today's topic. But before that, let us recap what we learned in part 1, because this particular series of webinars that I'm doing on wildlife videography is meant to be educative more than entertaining, and therefore has a slightly, how would I describe it? It might feel like a lecture, and I hope you're ready with your pens or pencils and a notepad to take notes, because this series is meant for some serious learning. And for those of you who have missed part 1, you can always go to nathab.com/webinars, which is the Daily Dose of Nature webpage, and dive into photo webinars and find part 1 and watch that. And before I start part 2, let's recap what we learned in part 1. So in part 1, I was trying to share with you all my own experience as traditionally a still photographer who's trying to dive into high quality cinematography with all the options and opportunities that modern technology has laid in front of us, and how camera manufacturers are now making still cameras equally capable video cameras. So we discussed why photographers should try video, and that was simply because the opportunity now exists. We were discussing about the differences in approach and the basic technical differences between wildlife still photography and wildlife cinematography. We discussed camera bodies and lenses a bit. We discussed stabilization options. We briefly dove into the technical jargon of media codecs. We discussed the workflow of managing power supply and managing data while we are filming. We discussed frame rates and which frame rates to choose under what conditions. We discussed the 180-degree shutter rule, the shutter speed rule that dictates that shutter speed be twice that of frame rate, and how that is important and how that is limiting, which is also something that we'll dive a little more into today. We discussed exposure and aperture and ISO, and a sample presets, starter presets, and a field checklist that you could print and keep with you, just to keep track of everything that's happening around you, because wildlife video takes a lot more involvement and a lot more engagement than wildlife still photography. So in today's webinar, which is part 2, we shall once again go a little bit, not a lot, just a little bit into gear selection. We will then discuss our actual field techniques, which will focus on how to set up your camera and optimize it for video, because typically we set our cameras up for still photography, and I'll tell you how to also set it up for video without affecting your still photo settings. We will go into autofocus techniques, because focus is crucial in still photography, but it's even more crucial in videography, which will also lead us to discuss manual focus techniques. And I was just mentioning the 180-degree shutter speed rule in the past slide as we were recapping the last webinar, and that does limit how we manage exposure in the field, because it ends up giving us overexposed video, and I'll tell you how we could go about managing that. We will also go a little into composition and storytelling in video terms, and dive further into stability and movement, as well as capturing audio, which is very important with video. And of course, we will end with a note on ethics and safety. So, starting with gear selection and preparation. In the last webinar, we discussed, how DSLRs and mirrorless cameras are both capable of producing high quality video these days. And, if it comes to a question of choosing a camera to dive into video, if you're thinking of getting a new camera for diving into video, then I would highly recommend mirrorless cameras. Of course, I will still stick to my old saying that the best camera for shooting wildlife is the one that you have with you. But in case you have a mirrorless camera, or in case if you're considering getting a new camera for wildlife videography or wildlife photography, then I would highly recommend going in for a modern mirrorless camera versus an older DSLR camera, because the mirrorless cameras are far better equipped for filming. These cameras truly are hybrid cameras in that they can shoot almost as high quality video as they can shoot stills, and therefore they give you the capability of doing both, and they're actually designed and manufactured with the intent of being dual purpose hybrid cameras, rather than, say, in the case of DSLR cameras, where they're primarily designed to be still cameras, but have the additional capability to also do a little bit of video. Mirrorless cameras, therefore, are far superior at managing heat, which is a serious problem with filming. When you keep the camera rolling for a very long time, it heats up. And the older cameras will then shut down when they heat up too much, so that they don't cause any damage to the circuitry and other things. So that becomes a major limiter with older generation cameras. Also, mirrorless cameras have, an electronic viewfinder, unlike the optical or glass viewfinder, the physical viewfinders that the older DSLR cameras have. So as you're filming, you are actually looking at the scene as it is being recorded. which means that if you change your exposure settings, for example, your viewfinder is going to reflect an accurate representation of that, which is not something that was possible with the optical viewfinders of DSLR cameras. So that does give you an enormous advantage in controlling exposure. Mirrorless cameras are also far superior at their autofocus abilities, especially when it comes to tracking moving subjects while filming video. DSLR cameras are, the better DSLR cameras are fantastic at tracking moving subjects for still photography, but when it comes to accurately and consistently tracking moving subjects, such as a flying bird, tracking a subject like that accurately while filming, mirrorless cameras are just unbeatable. Choosing the right camera, even among mirrorless cameras, also requires you to make a lot of decisions. Of course, the broad or the major point for choosing a camera is sensor size. So depending on whether you want a full frame camera or an APS-C camera or a camera with an even smaller sensor, such as a micro four thirds camera, that is it's a balance between image quality and size that you have to make. Of course, medium format cameras, which have very large sensors, are not really meant for wildlife. So I would avoid that unless I was doing some serious landscape photography or fine art portraiture or things like that. So sensor size is a key determinant of your decision, as well as the autofocus abilities of the models that you're trying to decide between. Look for a camera that is especially good in its autofocus abilities if you want to use it for filming wildlife. A long battery life, of course, is helpful because shooting video just drains a lot of battery. So cameras with good battery life, and of course you will want to have extra batteries. Cameras with good battery lives are good. And weather sealing is something very key that you want to look at for any camera that has got anything to do with wildlife, because when you're in the outdoors, there's heat, there's humidity, there's cold, there's snow, there's rain, there's dust, there's all of that. So you want to consider weather sealing as a very key selling point for any model that you might be considering. And of course, then there is always the biggest determinant of every purchase decision, which is price. So, that of course is a major consideration, but fortunately now we have cameras that are capable of doing wildlife photography and wildlife videography at almost every budget, starting from the entry-level mirrorless cameras to the medium-end and high-end ones. So, ultimately, buying a camera is a personal decision, but these are some of the factors that you might want to consider. And of course, there is the question of choosing the right lens. Now, with still photography, we try to lean more towards the prime lenses and the stellar long telephoto lenses, with massive apertures and absolutely top quality glass. And that is something that you can fortunately afford to compromise on when it comes to video. Prime lenses, of course, produce absolutely the best quality, the best sharpness, the best color rendition, and all of that is more apparent in still photos than it is in video. So video in that sense is more forgiving, and you can afford to get by with, say, a medium end long telephoto zoom lens and still produce stellar cinema quality video without actually having to invest in the top quality glass. Having a prime lens, while it has its advantages, also limits your view, your angle of view, because you can't zoom out or zoom in on a prime lens. Um, uh, your view is fixed, and you are basically stuck with a particular focal length unless you have the time to change that lens or change the camera you're shooting with. And with video, you want more versatility than that. You want to be able to zoom in and out. So zoom lenses work really well. You don't have to get the absolute top end zoom lenses to get quality video. You can get, the medium range lenses, such as the typical 150 to 600 millimeter zoom lenses with not very wide apertures, and still be able to get really good quality video. Because as we'll discuss later on the subject of exposure, while shooting video, you're also often shooting in narrower apertures than you're shooting than when you're shooting stills. So the fact that some of the lower end or medium range zoom lenses do not have a very wide aperture should not be a major limiting factor. So, if you have a wide to medium telephoto or wide to standard length zoom lens, along with a medium telephoto to a long telephoto zoom lens, just two lenses, you're set. You're set for video. Additionally, a lot of cameras will allow you to actually crop into the sensor while filming without any loss of resolution. So you can switch to DX mode on a full frame camera, and it will give you 1.5 times additional magnification. So say, for example, a 400 millimeter lens mounted on a full frame mirrorless camera can film in DX crop mode and give you the equivalent of a 600 millimeter zoom without actually any loss of resolution, because these sensors are large enough that even in the crop mode, they can give you the full resolution of whatever resolution you choose to shoot in, be it 1080p HD or 4K or sometimes even 8K. Of course, while filming, you will also require a number of other accessories, the bare basics of which are spread around this page. You might want a monopod or ideally a tripod, and you would want to use a fluid head rather than, say, a ball head or a Wimberley or something of that sort. Fluid head gives you that accurate control over smooth panning, which is crucial in video. And you will need a set of neutral density filters, and we'll go into why you would need that a little later in this webinar. You might also want a handheld gimbal support, which has a built-in gyroscope that can actually help keep your camera steady and stable while you are forced in situations to actually be filming with your hands because you don't have tripod access. You will also, of course, need a good microphone to record quality audio, and you will need storage accessories. You'll need multiple cards and card readers and a solid state drive for downloading your pictures, your videos onto while out in the field, because video consumes both power and space like nothing else. You will, always be managing storage. Video requires a lot of storage, so you will have to build economy into your shooting habits so that you don't unnecessarily film, because the more you film, the more data you gather, the more storage you'll have to deal with. And of course, spare batteries, because video, as I just mentioned, consumes batteries like nothing else. So these are the bare basic accessories that you will need for a filming kit. And of course, there is no limit to how high you can go with, or how many more accessories you can get, because there's absolutely no limit to that. You could keep getting tremendous amounts of more accessories to help make your filming easier and better, and there's really no top limit to that. So I will stick to the bare basics. Setting up your camera for video is also very important. It's not as simple as, you shooting stills and then you flick a button and you press record and you start recording video. It's not how that works. The exposure settings and several other settings that you choose for video will be different from what you would typically be choosing for stills. And that's something that we discussed in detail in the last part. So for those of you who want more detail on that, please go back to part 1 and watch that. But in general, you would want to go to your video menu in your camera. You would want to change your exposure to manual. You would not want the camera to automatically control things such as exposure and white balance, because with video, what happens is that in the middle of a sequence, if your exposure changes or your white balance changes, then that ruins the whole sequence for you, because there is no uniformity from start to finish. With still photos, you can shoot away 30 frames a second, and each of those frames could have a different exposure or a different white balance, and that would be absolutely fine, because you are only at the end of the day going to use 1 or 2 or 3 frames, and they can look different and it'll be fine. But with video, from start to finish of every sequence, you want uniformity, and uniformity and consistency are key in cinematography. And I think that is the key mindset or approach change that a still photographer requires to cultivate to be successful as a cinematographer. So set your ISO manually. Before you start filming, before you start shooting a sequence, you need to make up your mind about what you want your ISO, your frame rate, your white balance to look like, so that you can dial those in beforehand before you start shooting. Once you make your video settings, your camera, more often than not, most models, will learn to recognize that. And say, for example, in my case, I shoot with a Nikon Z9, and when my camera is in still photography mode, I'm shooting in aperture priority, and my camera knows that. And the moment I just flick the switch to video, my camera already recognizes that I like to shoot my video in manual mode. So it automatically switches to manual mode, and all the video settings start applying. And I can just then more or less do a quick check and press the record button, and it starts rolling. So yeah, you need to make sure that you go into your video menu, choose your file type, choose your frame rate, choose your resolution, and choose your autofocus settings, most importantly, because you might want to choose different autofocus settings for video. And I'll discuss that later. And most importantly, cameras and lenses these days come with a lot of extra buttons, custom buttons or function buttons that you can ascribe individual duties to for immediately switching certain settings, or going from one mode to another without actually having to take your eye off the viewfinder and going back into the menu and then finding things and changing that. You can actually ascribe specific tasks to different buttons on your camera and your lenses, and that is very useful while working as a dual, as a photographer and a videographer simultaneously. Now with video, especially wildlife video, focus is crucial. Your subject is not under your control, and your camera is barely under your control. With a fast-moving, unpredictable subject, animal or bird, it is very difficult to keep track of focus. And with autofocus, if it's a fairly clean frame with no distractions, the cameras do a pretty decent job of acquiring focus and keeping focus on your subject. But there is always the chance that your camera might mistake a bright flower or a leaf or something like that to be your subject and keep switching focus between the subject and this distraction. So it's important, on the one hand, to know the strengths of autofocus and utilize them. Yet, on the other hand, it is important to keep full manual control. So I'll try and explain how you can achieve that. Now, every camera has several different autofocus modes. There is, of course, AFS, which is single shot autofocus, which all of us are aware of. It is an autofocus mode that acquires focus. It is meant for stationary subjects. So in landscape photography, that's what you would use. Single shot autofocus will acquire focus on the subject. And once it's locked focus, if the subject moves, the camera does not then again refocus. It keeps focus where it had initially locked focus. So it is not probably something that you would want to use with videography. There is continuous autofocus again, which will lock focus on the subject and continue to, or attempt to continue to track it as your subject is moving about. Now, this is very useful, and but this only works as long as you keep the focus button on your camera, which could be the shutter button, or, as is more preferable and more practical, there's a back button, autofocus button at the back of your camera that you could use, or you could ascribe autofocus function to a button in the back of your camera. So autofocus continuous will work as long as you have your autofocus button pressed. The moment you let go of that button, your camera will stop following the subject. Personally, I prefer this mode the most for my wildlife filming as well as still photography. There is also something called AFF, which is autofocus follow, where you don't have to press any button and the camera itself will acquire focus on what it considers the subject and will then automatically follow the subject as it moves around the frame. The problem with that is if you give full control to the camera, then the camera might make mistakes. It might lose track of the subject if it briefly goes behind cover only to re-emerge again. So say you have a deer walking across your frame and you're following it with your camera and it's in AFF mode and your camera has locked focus on the deer and is following it as it walks on a meadow, and then there's a bush and the deer vanishes behind the bush. What your camera will automatically do is it will start focusing on the bush, and when the deer re-emerges from behind the bush on the other side, it will then again switch focus from the bush to the deer, which looks very jumpy and unprofessional. What you would want is for the bush to remain out of focus and for the deer to continue to be in focus when it re-emerges from behind that distraction. So in that case, you can either use autofocus continuous while and use that, and the moment the deer vanishes behind or begins to vanish behind the bush, you let go of your autofocus button, and then once it re-emerges, you engage autofocus again. Or ideally, you would just use manual focus, and that would keep autofocus smooth. There's also autofocus automatic, where the camera itself decides to use decides what kind of autofocus to use. I would not recommend using that in video. One of the best advantages of mirrorless cameras these days are that almost all of them are capable of something called subject detection. So the camera can recognize an airplane, a person, a bird, and or a human face, and lock focus on the eye of the subject. Now, with wildlife photography or filmmaking, of course, we are not concerned with airplane mode, so we'll leave that aside. But I found it to be best to permanently leave my camera in bird mode, because in bird detection mode, the camera's autofocus is most sensitive, and bird mode works absolutely perfectly with animals and people. The reverse is not true. Face detection or human face detection might not necessarily work as well with animal faces or bird faces, but bird mode works really well with animals and people. So that's a pro tip, if you will, and just set your subject detection to bird and forget it, and that'll take care of all your wildlife photography. You don't have to constantly switch between bird and animal and bird every time you're switching subjects. So in subject detection mode, especially bird and animal detection mode, the camera tries to lock in on the eye of the subject by itself. It tries and detects the eye of the subject and locks focus on it, and then it tries to keep focus on it. And that is one of the key advantages of modern mirrorless cameras, which is one of the reasons why they're so good for wildlife filmmaking. And they do an amazing job of keeping track most of the time, especially when there aren't many distractions. They do an amazing job of keeping track of a moving subject. So say, for example, you're filming a soaring bird, bird that's in flight, and you're filming, and there's no distractions in the foreground and background, and the background is, say, just the sky. Most cameras will absolutely have perfect focus on the bird's eye the whole time, and that is fantastic with filming. But in busy environments and with distractions, sometimes this eye tracking focus might it'll not fail, but it might keep switching between the bird and distractions, or the animal and distractions, way too often. And you don't want that to happen in video. In video, you want everything to remain uniform and constant and smooth. So another pro tip here, you can actually go into the menu of your camera, into the video settings menu, and dig up a setting which lets you control the sensitivity of bird eye tracking or animal eye tracking modes. And if you reduce the sensitivity to make it really slow, make it less sensitive, then what happens is that if momentarily your subject is lost behind cover or behind distractions, then the camera will not immediately hurry to refocus on something else. It will wait till the subject is seen again, and then lock focus on it again. So that's a setting you might want to note down and look up. But for absolutely flawless autofocus, for flawless focus tracking, nothing really beats old school manual focus. And while manual focusing can be quite a skill to acquire, and especially when it comes to tracking moving subjects using manual focus, it does take a lot of practice. But our modern mirrorless cameras have made it much easier with a feature called focus peaking. So as you control the focus clutch of your lens, the moment your subject is perfectly in focus, you have these red, you can actually choose whatever color you want the dots to be, but you usually have red because that's the easiest to see. Uh, um, uh, these red illumination coming up on the subject, and wherever the focus has peaked, you will have the maximum amount of illumination. So that's an easy way of keeping track of precise manual focus. So do use that. That feature exists in almost all mirrorless cameras. Now we had discussed exposure triangle, um, and ISO and aperture and depth of field and the relationship between aperture and shutter speed and all of that in part one. But I will still again want to go briefly into exposure and image quality again in the context of field settings and how to manage it in the field. Now, I was talking about the 180-degree shutter speed rule, which limits the shutter speed that you use. So if you're shooting at 30 frames per second and your shutter speed then needs to be locked at 1/60th of a second. 1/60th of a second is too slow, or it lets in too much light for most conditions when filming wildlife, except maybe just at sunrise and very close to sunset. So with still photography, we are constantly struggling to deal with low light. We are constantly struggling to get to freeze the frame in low light and get a fast enough shutter speed and a wide enough aperture and a high enough ISO. With videography, that problem becomes the opposite. Here we are often dealing with too much light. So because your shutter speed is stuck at 60, if you happen to be shooting at 30 frames a second, or maybe if you're shooting slightly slow motion, faster action sequences at say 60 frames per second, even then your shutter speed is at about 125th of a second, which is still often too, letting in too much light under most circumstances. And we always want to isolate our subject from the background, so we like having a wide aperture to have that shallow depth of field and make our subject stand out. But in bright conditions, we might, out of force, be have to use a narrower aperture like f8 or f10. But sometimes even this, along with the lowest possible ISO your camera is capable of, are incapable of controlling exposure. We get blown out, overexposed images like the kingfisher you see on top. What you want is a picture of is a video of the kingfisher looking like the one in the lower frame, perfectly exposed, blue sky, colors all accurate, and highlights and shadows under control. So for videography, ND filters, also known as neutral density filters, become absolutely absolutely required in many cases, unless if you only want to film at dawn and dusk. You will require neutral density filters, and they come in different ratings. So a neutral density filter is basically a dark piece of glass. It just cuts the light coming into your lens, and the high quality ones will not do anything to compromise the sharpness of your lens and quality of image. But the neutral density filter is going to cut down the amount of light entering your lens. So think of it as a tinted glass window on your car. And these filters come in different ratings that are denoted by even numbers, so ND2, ND4, ND6, ND8, and so on. You can either have individual filters for different ratings, or you also get ones that you can rotate to actually change the rating. So the quality ND filter will be expensive, but it's an expense that's worth investing in if you want to film wildlife. Now, coming to image quality. Now, there is always the rave about 4K, 6K, 8K, 12K. I mean, there is no end to it. And every few years, cameras will be able to film higher and higher resolutions. But as wildlife filmmakers, most of us are unlikely to broadcast our films on an IMAX screen, right? We will mostly be exhibiting our work on a computer screen or a good TV screen, or maybe on a projector on a wall. And for most purposes, 1080p HD is still enough, even in 2025. But of course, our cameras are capable of filming 4K and 8K. So you might want to future-proof your footage a little bit and probably shoot 4K. But you have to keep in mind that the higher your resolution, the more space it's going to take up, and the more work it is later when you want to sit and get into your studio and post-process your video and do all the post-processing work, and it's going to be a nightmare dealing with files that large and that heavy. So you have to take a call as to what your objective of filming is and where you're most likely to show your videos. It's most likely going to be on your phone most of the time, or your iPad or your Mac, or on your TV screen at home, or maybe on a projector screen at your local club. So for those purposes, 1080p is more than enough. You also don't necessarily have to shoot in ProRes or log or raw mode unless you are planning for a Netflix production, which you should if you are keen on it. But if you're not planning on doing that, you can just shoot at H.264 or H.265 10-bit codecs, which again we discussed in detail in part 1. And when you're out in the field, traveling in Africa or in India or Antarctica or wherever, the convenience of managing your files, of being able to come back to camp and download your stuff and be able to go through it, that and your broadcast choices should dictate your file size. Don't shoot in 8K just because your camera can shoot in 8K. Give it a thought. Do what is more practical. Now, we were talking about electronic viewfinders, and as you look through your viewfinder while filming, your camera gives you a few tools to keep track of your exposure. And one of them, and the most important one, regardless of whether you're shooting still or video, is the histogram, the good old-fashioned histogram. The histogram from left to right shows you how much data in the image that is being collected, how much of that information, how much of your picture is in the shadows area, is in the midtones area, and how much is in the highlights area. So basically, from dark to bright, from absolute black to absolute white. Typically, you would want most of the histogram to remain towards the right-hand side of the frame, mostly in the midtones and highlights area, but not exceeding the highlights area. That is, not clipping highlights, not losing this. A clipping of highlights will happen, for example, if you overexpose, which is what we were discussing just a slide or two ago. So if you overexpose, you will lose highlights. There will be parts of the image that are so bright that they're just blank white, and no amount of post-processing that you do will be able to recover the details in that part of the image. So try and keep your histogram mostly to the right, but not all the way. And the advantage of an electronic viewfinder is that while you are actually in the act of filming, you can still keep an eye on the little histogram to the side of the viewfinder and just be sure that you're doing things right. Now, there is also something called a zebra. Zebra in America, zebra in the rest of the world, which will warn you if some part of the image or some part of the video or some part of the screen is being overexposed by highlighting it with zebra stripes. So turn on those functions in your camera so that you can keep track of these things and bring things under control when they need to be. Now let's come to the most important part of this part of the webinar, which is all the technicalities and all the how things work. You can go out into the field, set up your camera, and get a decent piece of video. But what good is a piece of video if it doesn't tell a story? Of course, one could do not one, but several webinars on how to tell creative stories, and you could have lectures on creative storytelling. But I'll try and just nudge you in the right direction in the next couple of slides so that you know where to start. Composition, like in still photography, is key in videography. In fact, in videography, it's even more crucial because you have not only got to compose your frame with aesthetics in mind, but you also have to compose your frame keeping enough room for anything that your subject might do, because your subject is not going to stay still in the frame. It's going to move around, or it might even move out or just vanish from the frame. So you have to decide whether you want to keep tracking the frame as the subject moves, or you want your subject to walk in from one end and walk out of the other end of your frame. All of that are things that you will have to decide beforehand. But as you compose your image, as you compose your frame, you have to keep a few basic rules in mind. First of all, as with still photography, eye contact with your subject really makes the frame stand out. All of us, when we are watching animals, we are looking for eye contact. Do leave more space above the animal's head than you do below the animal's body. So give it a little headroom. And you also have to give something that we call breathing space ahead of the animal. So that, as the animal is moving, or if the animal is stationary and it might move, there is enough space ahead of the animal to, for you to show that activity without the animal beginning to vanish from the frame, or without there being negative space in front of the animal. You always want negative space behind the animal. Look at this frame of this elephant that is running because it's excited. I have left more space ahead of it, far more space ahead of it than there is behind it. And also, very important, it's always useful to follow the rule of thirds law. That way you get the most aesthetic compositions. You frame and align your subject along the rule of thirds, lines and intersections. And always keep track of depth of field, because you ideally want there to be sufficient isolation between your subject and its background. Capturing behavior is something that takes enormous amount of patience, of course. You can't capture behavior like this. Here you have a tigress being chased out of the water by a massive crocodile, on one of our trips. And things like this don't happen, on command. You have to be patient, and the more time you spend, the more likely you are to capture behavior. So there is, of course, patience, but there is also anticipation. You have to be ready for when behavior happens. So you have to watch your subject closely enough to be able to predict, what it's about to do. And of course, having an expert guide helps a lot with that, because your guide will be helping you with that. And of course, education about the subject before you even travel, learning up, reading up, understanding your subject animals will help you understand them better and therefore anticipate things better. And of course, the more and more you visit a destination, the more time you get to spend there, the more you get to see, and the more happens before you. But while focusing on capturing behavior while you film, don't forget the fundamental rule of PIE, P-I-E. For any subject that you're filming, try and get at least 3 different shots of that subject. First, of course, is a portrait. You get a close-up shot, a nice close-up shot showing all the intimate details of your subject. Try and get interaction if it's happening, either between 2 animals, of the same species, or an animal of one species with an animal or an animal of another species, or an animal and its interaction with its environment. So try and get some interaction, and try and get a shot of your animal in its environment. So portrait, interaction, animal, PIE. Sorry, portrait, interaction, and environment, PIE. That is a very easy to remember rule that helps us get enough pictures or videos to at least tell a very basic story. Lighting and background, of course, are very crucial. If you are filming in the golden hour, you get nice dreamy shots. So from sunrise until the first couple of hours after it, and the first couple of hours before sunset until dusk. But if you want detail and documentation videos, for example, where you want colors and everything to be absolutely accurate and clear, then you might want to shoot in flat or muted light in the middle of the day. In harsh light conditions, such as mid-afternoon, it's best to avoid filming because you'll get really unpleasant looking footage. Do try and aim for clean backgrounds, because that always helps your subject stand out and there's less distraction. Now, planning your shoot is very important. Unlike with still photography, actually, even in still photography, I would advise that one should actually plan their shoot in order to come back with a story, rather than just going and randomly shooting at whatever comes one's way at a destination. But with filming, it becomes even more unforgiving. If you haven't planned your shoot, you can't just end up somewhere and take random clips of footage, and then when you come back and you try and put all of that together in a storyline, it doesn't fit. So it's very important to plan your shoot, have at least a reference, a draft script of sorts. Of course, the animals will not follow the script, but if you have a broad script as an idea, you can try and shoot according to it and try and fit that together as a story. Do write down a shot list. I'll give you an example of what a shot list looks like in the next slide here. Do try and write down a shot list of the things you might see and the shots you might want to get of them. That, printed and carried in your pocket while you're shooting, will always help you put together more coherent a narrative, and will give you clips that you can later put together in a nice story pattern. So you can take a screenshot. I'll give you a second to do that. This is just a draft, an example shot list that I asked ChatGPT to help me with. All right, I hope you've taken a screenshot. Stability and movement, of course, are key with wildlife filming. We had discussed this in the last part, but I'll go a little more into it, especially when you're shooting handheld. There will be circumstances when you're forced to shoot handheld. And again, thanks to ChatGPT for generating this sketch for me. But as you hold your long telephoto lens and try to shoot either photo or video with it, having the correct posture does help. Ideally, you don't want to be shooting handheld because you'll never get consistently good video with that, but you might get short clips in short moments in extreme circumstances. Posture really helps keep things stable. If you're standing, stand with your feet at least shoulder wide. but ideally you want to be crouching down so that there's more stability, more support. Your left elbow should press close into your chest like that, and your right palm should support your lens fully. You should allow your lens's weight to fully rest on your palm. I'm sorry, there's actually a mistake with the illustration. It's switched left and right, but yeah, your support, the hand which supports your lens should allow the lens's weight to rest fully onto your palm, and your elbow should press into your chest, while your face and your eye should help stabilize the body of your camera as you press in your face like that. And again, with mirrorless cameras and the electronic viewfinders, you can actually do that. With optical viewfinder cameras, you can't film like that. Breathing control, of course, does help, but when you're shooting handheld, what really helps are VR, lens stabilization. It's called VR in the language of Nikon. In other brands, it's called other things, image stabilization and shake reduction and so on. But mirrorless cameras will also give you sensor stabilization, which is known as inbuilt image stabilization. Make sure to turn these features on both on your body and your lens, and together they'll work really well to try and reduce shake. And of course, there are tripods and monopods and handheld gimbals that you can use for adding stability, and nothing really beats a good tripod with a nice fluid head. Audio capture is really important. Now, I know I've tried to play this video in my past webinar and it did not play very well, but I'll try again now. There, you saw that video of the rhino feeding in the rain, and you could hear thunder and rain and natural sounds. And that is far more pleasant than having a rhino feeding in your video, but you're not having quality sounds. The sounds probably are of your companions in the Jeep, or your own breathing or things like that. So that really kills good video, good footage. You would ideally want to get quality sound, quality audio along with your footage, and you would want a mic, and very specifically a shotgun mic, to go along with your filming kit, because a shotgun mic actually carries, it records audio from a very narrow angle of view, and it tries to record audio that is coming from far away and straight ahead of the camera, rather than the peripheral audio that is coming from the photographer and things and people around the photographer. And last, before I end, I would like to remind you of field ethics and safety. You see, the welfare of our subject is of paramount importance. I will not go on reading through everything here. You can all read the list here. But the safety of and the welfare of our subject is far more important than our desire for quality footage. So under no circumstances should we compromise that. We should not be intrusive into a natural scene, into a wildlife activity. We should be quiet. That's very important at any wildlife sighting. We should be considerate towards others around us who are also enjoying that scene. And we should always keep safety, both our own safety and the safety of the animals and birds that we are watching or filming, as topmost priority. And also do not forget the safety of your gear, and do consider insurance for your gear, your trip, and for emergencies when you go out on a filming expedition. So with that, I will bring this webinar to an end. And Rob, you can tell me if there are any questions.
All right, Aditya, thank you. So I would like to remind everyone that if you do have questions, you can submit them via the question field in the control panel. Just go to the upper right-hand corner and click on those three lines. It'll drop down a field, and you can click on the question field, and that's where we're living. So let me ask you this. We do have a couple. Is post-processing available with video the way it is with still photography?
Yes, it is available, but the software tend to be, so it's a new learning curve. I won't say that the software is more complicated. It's just a different learning curve that photographers will have to relearn to try and post-process video. There are very powerful softwares available, but you will require a computer that is capable of far more computing power than what would be required with stills photography. And it is more time taking. It is definitely something that you will take a while to learn and master. So a lot of professional wildlife videographers will actually just collect their footage and dump a hard drive with a studio that they work with, and they will probably just oversee the post-processing, but let an actual professional do it. But you can still do it on your computer or even in your phone. But of course, if you have footage from a mirrorless camera, you might want to invest in a good computer and a good software like DaVinci Resolve, or even something as basic as iMovie to get started.
Gotcha. Thank you, Aditya. So in audio capture, how do you avoid distractions or noise around you, other people talking?
So, you've got to make the best of every situation, Rob. And sometimes things are not under your control. Having a shotgun mic really does help with that because it will try and isolate the noises coming from around the camera and focus on the noises coming a fair distance away ahead of the camera. That's the whole purpose of a shotgun mic. A shotgun mic is like a telescope. It focuses in a very narrow area ahead of the camera. So that should take care of most of it for you. But of course, if there is anything too loud around you, it might make it into the audio, in which case you can't do much about it except probably do things in post. But shotgun mic and just making the best of every situation is what you can try.
Gotcha. Thanks for that advice. We can't tell everyone to be quiet. I know that. All right. So the bird eye detection, is that something that's only on video, or is that something that is available for still photos as well?
It's available for both. You can use it on stills and video. I use it a lot on stills these days.
Oh, very interesting. Well, it looks like that's about the last question that we do have for today, Aditya. So I'd like to throw it back to you for any closing comments you may have for us today.
Thank you, Rob, and sorry for exceeding the top of the hour to our audience. I hope you found today's webinar useful. I hope you were taking notes, and I hope you will be encouraged to go out and try your hand at filming. Thank you, everyone. Look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.
Aditya, thank you so much for taking time and presenting for us today. It was very helpful, so thank you so much. And well, I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. So if you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab on a photography expedition, please give us a call at 800-543-8917, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and the replay will be available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We will see you next time.